COVID-19 and the coordination team of the Break Free from Plastic movement in Europe. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Very nice to see you all. I'm going to share my screen for the presentation, which means I won't see you at all the chat, so feel free to interrupt me if you need to interrupt me, and thank you for the interpretation very much. So I'm gonna share my screen. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm hoping you can see my screen now. So indeed, my name is Justine. I'm the European coordinator for the Break Free from Plastic movement. So the Break Free from Plastic movement is a global movement of NGOs and individuals. So it brings close to 3,000 organizations together and different level of engagement, and then also individual supporters. And the movement was created in 2016. And really with this idea to focus on systemic change, so to really look at the plastic pollution topic and crisis across the life cycle of plastic. So not only focusing on one element, but trying to look at the overall picture, and also trying to address the issue focusing on prevention rather than cure. So the movement is active across the globe. There's members in Turkey as well. And so we've been really basically working all together with one common goal, that is to end plastic. And today in this short presentation, I would like to give you a bit more context on the topic of plastic and plastic pollution, and a few more elements and some of the complexity in the topic that are really important to take into account if we really want to address the issue and solve the plastic crisis. So if I'm showing those pictures, I'm sure you've seen many of those. We've seen many of those pictures of plastic waste in the ocean, on beaches, in different environments as well. And there's certainly more and more awareness about the topic. I think some of those pictures we see less of some of those. The top right one was taken just 2 weeks ago on the shore of Spain, where there was a pellet spill. So pellets are like the small material that is going to be used to make basically every plastic product to be molded in a certain way. And there was containers lost from ships on the coast of Spain, and there was a massive pellet spill. And those stories we tell a bit less. And then if the picture at the bottom is one of the big petrochemical facilities in the US, where basically contribute like part of the big petrochemical industry that is producing plastic. And I also wanted to show this graph, which shows basically the growth of a number of materials between the 1970s and 2015. And you can really see that plastic is really at the top in terms of growth. And basically, all the product, like half of the plastic ever produced was produced in the last 20 years. So in a way, it's a very recent crisis, but yet a very massive one. But it also shows that we can act and turn things around. At the moment, it's expected to grow quite massively still. And obviously with everything that goes with it. But I just wanted to say that often we see more of the pictures of the waste in the ocean than the pictures of also where plastic come from, for example. And so I wanted to link it to some of the narratives we hear a lot about plastic. So as I said, we often hear that it's primarily a marine pollution issue. And of course, plastic in the ocean, it's a huge issue from many reasons in terms of impacting biodiversity, the environment, climate. But the pollution of plastic is also occurring in many other environments, and including land and other ecosystems. And so it's important not to reduce it to being a marine pollution issue. We've also heard a lot, at least where I come from in Western Europe, about the fact that the global south is largely responsible for plastic pollution, and that a lot of the pollution is there, and that other countries are doing much better. And one of the things we've shown through the Breakthrough from Plastic movement being a global movement is actually showing where plastic is produced, consumed, and yes, it may end up in global South countries because of waste trade, for example, but really trying to show the much more complex situation. A common narrative that is often pushed by a number of industry players as well is that it's basically the responsibility of the consumers because they don't behave, because they litter, they throw away their plastic, etc. And it's obviously consumers have a big part to play in the solutions, but it's also very easy to say so. And it's just a way of blaming the consumers rather than also looking at the responsibilities of the companies that put those plastic on the markets, knowing as well that most of the plastic on the market are not recyclable. So there's not much of something happening with it at the end of life anyway. Another common narrative is that plastics are safe and hygienic and they're needed to protect our food, etc. And I'll come back to that, but unfortunately, plastic are not safe for most of them. Another narrative that we hear a lot is that we will be able to find solution. Like there's lots of developments around maybe an algae that will be able to solve it all, or a bacteria that is eating plastic, or like kind of techno fixes at the end of life that will allow us to just continue consuming plastic as we want, and then being able to sort out the issue at the end of life. It's not that simple, unfortunately. Otherwise, we will already have implemented it and we wouldn't be here today. And the final element is one thing that is also pushed quite a lot is possibly substituting one material by another. So let's say fossil fuel plastic by bio-based plastic or plastic by paper. But one thing is also that just shifting material can largely displace the impacts, but not necessarily bring a systemic solution to what we're trying to address. So I just wanted to share those kind of common narrative, and those are, in a way, narratives that kind of hide the complexity of the issue and the whole value chain of plastic. So I just wanted to share that a little bit. And what we've been doing as a Breakthrough from Plastic movement is trying to go beyond those common narratives and challenge them, actually, and show what's really happening. So I just wanted to share a little bit what the life cycle of plastic actually looks like. Because indeed, if we want to really figure out what the solutions are, we need to understand the bigger picture, because it's not just about banning one product, even though it can contribute to the solution, but it's much wider if we really want to address the plastic crisis. So really briefly, this is like a visual representation of the plastic life cycle. And basically, pollution happens at every stage of the way. So it's not just when it ends up in the environment or the ocean, but pollution associated with plastic happens all the way. So if we start from extraction, I think you know that basically almost all plastic come from fossil fuel. So in that sense, plastic production is exacerbating the climate crisis. So it's really contributing to the oil and gas consumption, and increasingly so. So petrochemicals, so plastic production and the production of other petrochemicals is really seen as a new market for many fossil fuel companies. And it's growing in terms of, so plastic is taking more and more space in terms of oil demand. So just to give you a sense, by 2050, in the current projections, plastic production and other petrochemicals processes will account for half of the global oil demand growth. So it's really important. So it's seen really as a new market, while, for example, we move from diesel to electric cars. So plastic is really seen as a way to keep producing oil for materials, etc. And obviously, this is completely incompatible with the objectives that we have to limit climate change, including the Paris Agreement. If we look after extraction, like in terms of production, sorry. Yes. So when we go at the production site, so I showed a picture earlier, but it is a very intense processes, very intense in terms of energy use, but also production releases lots of toxics. There's a lot of chemicals involved in the production of plastics, which can impact the workers, but also the communities around those facilities. So more or less, well, we know that more than 13,000 chemicals are used in plastic. And among those, more than 3,000 are classified as hazardous. And if we look at those 3,000, only 4% of those are actually regulated by laws at the international level. So that's a very, very small percentage. And then there's a whole range of chemicals, about 6,000, where we basically don't have data because they haven't been assessed for safety. So basically, plastic are really like a chemical mix of which part is very hazardous and part is basically unknown at the moment. So yeah, this production stage as well is causing a lot of pollution directly, and chemical pollution, etc., and impacting the environment and the health, especially of the communities that are close to the facilities. And then if we go to the distribution and use, so then the plastic is produced, you have those small little pellets, the ones I showed earlier, and then it's going to be molded in very different products in our daily lives. And what we realized is most of those products are actually designed for single use. So they're designed to be used once and then thrown away, or they're designed for a very short lifespan. So we really have like loads of products that are on the market and not meant to be reused. Most of them are also not meant to be recycled. And what we also notice is that a lot of the chemicals in plastic can leak into, let's say, the foods that we eat, and the packaging. So the packaging and the chemicals in the packaging can leak in the food that then we consume, or it can leak into our homes because we have plastic everywhere in our homes. And then that can really pose a problem to our health. And then there's the big issue of microplastic, because plastic tends to degrade in microplastics. That can be the case of products, also our clothes, textiles, or synthetic textile shed microplastics. And then we end up with basically plastic everywhere in our environment, inside, outside, and that's a source of a concern definitely for the environment and for us. And when we come to the end of life, which for many plastics products is happening very quickly because they're single use, so we use them for a very short time, and then we end to the end of life. And the reality is that most plastics until now have been incinerated, landfilled, or have entered the environment directly. Less than 10% of plastic globally have been recycled so far. Many of the plastic products are not designed to be recycled. And for some of them, it can also be dangerous to actually recycle them because of the chemicals I mentioned. And so we have a lot of technology that have been pushed. So incineration, for example, or waste to energy, that are actually not solving the issue, and that can also create health hazards and hazards for the environment. And one practice that has been extremely common is the fact that I would say global north country, it's a bit more complex than that, have been sending their waste away to global south country, mainly, but also to other countries like Turkey, actually. So a lot of the waste has been basically sent from, let's say, Western Europe to Turkey. So countries have just kind of escaped their responsibility in managing their own waste and shipping it away to other countries, where they don't necessarily have the capacity to treat those plastics, who have usually very, very little value. So there's not much to do with it. And then it creates those images that we see here. It's also impacting the communities in the receiving country and impacting the environment there. So I basically wanted to give you this picture, which is not a very positive picture, but just to show that if we really want to address the plastic topic, it's important to look at the whole value chain, because we need to act at every like part of the value chain to really address the issue. And I would say the first thing we need to do is really to look at how we reduce the production and consumption of plastic. We usually use this image, or we've used this image quite a lot in the movement at the beginning, to show that when there's an issue, you usually look at trying to stop the source rather than just addressing the symptoms. So we've used this bathtub kind of like metaphor quite a bit. Like if you come home and like you see there's a overflowing in your bathroom, you're not going to start removing the water. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to go and close the tap if you forgot to close it. And then you're going to take care of the water that is there already. What we've done with waste is that we're trying to address the waste at the end of life while actually putting more and more and more plastic on the market. And there's no way we can address the issue that way, because we already have so much plastic at the moment, which we don't know how to treat and what to do with. And then we're keeping flooding the market with more and more plastic, of most of them little value. So really, one of the first things we need to really address is look at how do we reduce our consumption of plastic. And as I said at the very beginning, half of the plastic produced has been produced in the last 20 years. So there was many other ways to do without plastic or with durable plastic before. So just maybe to give a few elements on what we're trying to achieve as a movement is also to look at the plastic issue, not just as an environmental issue, but really looking at it as a system. And I put a few words there. It's absolutely not a comprehensive list, but I just wanted to link a few things. So as I think it's quite known, obviously, plastic pollution is a threat to biodiversity, to climate change, is also contributing largely to pollution in general in the world. But there's also an element of social justice in the plastic issue that is maybe less often discussed, because obviously the right to a healthy environment is a basic human right. And then we understand, like when we look at the details, we see that, for example, at the beginning of the life of plastic, so if we're looking at extraction or production of plastic, a lot of those very polluting facilities are close to, are actually in people of colors community or marginalized communities. So they're impacting those communities much more than other types of populations. But if we also look at the end of life with waste trade, for example, a lot of the waste is shipped into low-income communities and just impacting them much more as well. So there's really this really strong social justice element as well, because in a way, plastic is a symptom of many other issues that we see with extractive practices, and some would say also some of the neo-colonialism practices. Then I mentioned human health here because plastic is impacting everyone's health. Obviously, the workers, the communities that are close to facilities, but also just everybody, because we all consume plastic on a daily basis, and plastic is around everyone. And there's more and more evidence of the impact of plastic on human health, so linked to the chemicals that I mentioned that are hazardous and present in plastic, but also there's more and more research around microplastic and their impacts on human health as well. And I've just mentioned a final point when we look also at the whole value chain and the solutions, who is really accountable for it, and who should be responsible for financing the solutions, because a lot of the time the pressure and the burden has been put either on consumers or on local authorities who are dealing with waste management infrastructure, etc. Very little accountability has been put so far on the producers of plastic products and the feedstock of plastics. But they are the main responsible for putting it on the market. But then in most countries, they don't have any responsibility in terms of what's happening at the end of life of those products they put on the market. And obviously, a lot of the damage has already been done. And there's still a big question mark on who is also financially contributing to remediate to those damages. So I just want to say that we're trying as a movement to really address the issue through those various lenses. And that's why we also work with numerous actors that are not necessarily in the environmental sector, but more from the environmental justice group or social justice groups and other actors as well. And I'll come to an end, but I just wanted to share maybe a few solutions. So one of the things we work on and feel like are a good way to start looking at the solutions is really, as I said, really focusing on reduction. So trying to address the issue of plastic production and pollution really at the beginning, upstream at the production level, rather than just trying to address the plastic issue from the plastic waste angle at the end of the value chain. The importance of science and independent science, because we see many actors coming in, and often some of the solutions they propose, technological solutions, etc., are not really scientifically approved, I would say, and it's so yeah, the importance of science in developing the solutions, the importance of policies as well. There's a lot that we can all do as consumers on a daily basis, but at one point, if we're not given the right choice or an affordable choice, etc., or if there's no regulation that really like supports the industry transitioning to something else, for example, from single-use products to reusable products, we know it's not going to happen. So the importance of robust policies at different levels, from the local to the international level. There's actually at those years, those months, there's countries are negotiating a treaty on plastic, so an international legally binding agreement on plastic pollution. So we may hopefully in a couple of years have an international agreement on plastic, the same way we have one on climate change. And really trying solutions as well, like and showcasing those solutions, which is one thing we're trying to do through the movement, because we have such a diverse movement across region, and we the solutions are, some are easy and simple, others are more complex, but trying them and really seeing what works, what doesn't, and learning from that and moving together in direction. And while doing this, also challenging, as I said, the polluters, basically. So all the companies that are putting these products on the market without taking responsibility for what they actually put on the market, and fueling the crisis. And also challenging the role of the investors and the financial institutions, which are in a way participating to fueling the problem by financing big infrastructure, for example, that are not addressing the issue of plastic at all, but focus on end of life, or by funding research that basically has no chance of really going into a systemic change that we need. So I'll close there. So basically that's what we do as a movement. And we work in synergy, as I said, with other movements to really trying to make sure also the work we do on plastic doesn't impact others. Like we've also seen in some countries a move from plastic to paper, which then displays the impacts. And we know that obviously then it's displacing the impact on paper and deforestation and biodiversity as well. But again, thinking together how we redesign some of our production, distribution, and consumption models so that we use less single use altogether, and that we see how we really use our resources much more wisely, I would say. So I will end on this. Thank you very much, and I'm really happy to answer any question you may have. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Justine. We think it will be better to receive the questions at the end. If you will be with us until the end of the panel session, that would be nice. What do you think, Justine? Will you be with us? Yes? Okay, then. So let's continue with our second speaker, who is the Dr. Bethanie Carney Almroth from the University of Gothenburg, and who is member of the Coalition of Scientists for an Effective Plastics Agreement. Dr. Bethanie is a professor of environmental sciences in the Department of Biology and Environmental Sciences at the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. She has a background in fish physiology and ecotoxicology and works extensively in interdisciplinary groups addressing environmental pollution. The research focuses on the sources and the destiny of plastics and microplastics in the environment, chemicals in plastic materials, and the effects of exposure in aquatic animals. And she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in environmental science, animal physiology, aquatic toxicology, and biochemical toxicity, and leads a research group of PhD candidates and postdocs. And she is also an active science communicator and strives to inspire children and young students to take an interest in science and the environment. She works at the science policy interface and advises decision makers at various levels from local to national and international authorities. And she is also a steering committee member of the Coalition of Scientists for an Effective Plastics Agreement, advising country delegates on plastic science issues to support an ambitious agreement.
Dear Bethany, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi everyone. Now you know my whole CV. I can just start by saying that Justine and I did not compare notes before coming into this meeting today, so I will be repeating some of what she said. But as an ecotoxicologist, I've also pulled in some more data on chemicals, so I hope that you will find this interesting. And the fact that we're repeating each other just strengthens the idea that the science is true and being used in by different actors across the science the plastics ecosystem. Okay, so starting, I just want to set the scope for the global problem using the Sustainable Developmental Goals and what the UNFCCC has identified as the triple planetary crisis, looking at climate change, loss of biosphere integrity, and pollution. And in order to have a functioning planet, we need to have a strong planet to live on. And that's where these SDGs at the bottom, the blue and green colors, come in, where we need to have a healthy terrestrial ecosystem, a healthy aquatic and marine ecosystem. We need to have stable climate. We need to have clean water. And Justine also mentioned the connections between pollution and biodiversity and climate, which is very important to understand the problems because they are interconnected and they are very global. And again, to put it into perspective, the time period in which we are now living has been termed the Anthropocene. And this is because humans are now the major driving force on the planet. The Holocene, the time period before this, was a very stable time period with stable climate and stable biodiversity and so on. Human societies grew and thrived. But then we began our new way of living when we came into the industrial time period in the so-called Anthropocene. And we are now affecting the very basic functions of the planet. And we understand this through a research framework called the planetary boundaries. And this framework tries to understand how humans are impacting the function of the Earth system and how it is important for us to understand the stability or destability of these systems as they impact the ability of our species, humans, to survive. There are 9 systems that have been identified: ozone depletion, loss of biodiversity, climate change, ocean acidification, freshwater use, land system changes, nitrogen and phosphorus flows, atmospheric aerosol loading, and finally, number 9, release of chemical pollution and novel entities, meaning new things, things that did not exist on the planet during the Holocene, things that are made by humans. And when we look at the sum of the science around these questions, we can see this image, which is, it's the sum of the work of hundreds of scientists and thousands of research articles, showing us that we have moved outside of the safe operating space for 6 of these 9 boundaries, meaning that human activities are destabilizing the planet and how the planet functions, and also making our futures more unpredictable and more uncertain. The novel entities at the top there, that's the plastics and the chemicals that we're talking about. But we also see climate change, biodiversity loss, land and water use, and nutrient cycling, which have all been moved beyond a stable and predictable environment. When we're talking about chemicals, we're talking about a lot of different things. 350,000 different chemicals are registered for production globally. This is data from inventories that were put together from 19 different countries. 50,000 of those chemicals are confidential, so we don't know what they are. Industries are keeping that secret from us. And 70,000 of them are ambiguously described, so we don't really know what they are. And as Justine said, 13,000 substances have been used in plastics and plastics production, according to a technical report that came out from the UN this summer. And this is also a compilation of different data sources. And again, as you heard before, 3,200 of those are chemicals of concerns. The image there shows what classes of chemicals this includes: stabilizers, antioxidants, flame retardants, fillers, plasticizers, softeners. But there's a new report coming out that used additional data sources and puts this number up to 16,000, and 4,200 of those are chemicals of concern, meaning that we know that they have hazardous properties. If we look at the science around what these chemicals are doing on the planet, we can say that we know very little. We know very little about the large-scale impacts. When we understand the hazardous properties of chemicals, we usually understand the short-term impacts in single species and a single chemical exposure, while in reality, we have very complex exposure scenarios where organisms, including humans, are exposed to hundreds, if not more, chemicals at very different doses and very different environments. And the long-term effects is something that we know very little about. But this research group used AI to read 130,000 scientific publications, finding that we're only studying 3,500 chemicals within academia, 3,500 out of 350,000. So a very small percentage. And most of those chemicals are in turn those that are already regulated through legislation around pharmaceuticals and biocides, metals, plant production products, and REACH, which is the European chemicals legislation. So we know very little about what's going on. And in terms of large-scale environmental impacts on a more planetary level, we understand 65 chemicals, 65. So a lot of knowledge gaps. Now, when it comes to chemicals regulations, this is from the UNEP, another UNEP study from this summer, based on that 13,000 chemicals. We can see that there are 6,000 chemicals without hazard data. And that doesn't mean that they're not hazardous. That means that they haven't been thoroughly investigated. There are 3,800 chemicals that are of low concern. Again, not because they're not necessarily toxic, but because they have been only investigated to a small degree and not thoroughly investigated. Then we have 3,000 that are of concern, but are not regulated. So they're still in use, even though we know they're hazardous. And their evaluation showed us that 1%, this black wedge of chemicals and plastics, are regulated globally. So these are concerning numbers. That's 128 chemicals that are regulated in the Stockholm Convention, the Minamata Convention, and the Montreal Protocol. So a disappearingly small number of chemicals used in plastics are currently regulated globally. This is from a recent study put out by the Minderoo Foundation looking at human health impacts of chemicals. And this is looking at what's been published and what we know in terms of research. And here they found that we are studying about 1,500 chemicals on human health, or have been mapped for human health, and less than 30% of those have been studied. What the graph is showing us is the year these publications have come out, and then the amount of research that we see for different classes of chemicals. So bisphenols, PFAS, phthalates, and so on. There are few studies addressing the human health impacts of micro and nanoplastics. Even if that's a growing research field, we're learning more there. Very few of the studies on human health impacts have been done in low-income countries. Most of them are done in Western Europe and North America. We have very limited studies on elderly populations. The majority that have been done on children or men. There are a number of studies looking at the maternal effects, so pregnant women and the impacts on their children, fetal exposures, but there are no studies done looking at the effects of exposure in men and their impacts on the next generation, so their children. So this isn't something else that we don't understand. This is again, repeating what Justine just told us. And when we're trying to understand, I'm going to show you the plastics life cycle, but when we're trying to understand the global impacts of plastics, given all of these knowledge gaps and data gaps, we have to look at the whole picture, the systemic picture of the plastics life cycle, starting with extraction. You already heard that 99% of plastics produced from oil. We have a stage where we are moving into products that are coming out onto the market or being used in industrial settings. There's waste mismanagement or management issues around recycling and so on, and then trying to understand the impacts of this in the environment, even on a local scale before we reach the global scale, is one of the challenges that we're facing. And throughout this entire lifespan, we can have releases to the environment, leakages and spills, leachates reaching the environment and human bodies through production and use of plastics. This image is from the Scientist Coalition, which you were introduced to very quickly in the beginning. The Scientist Coalition, of which I am a member, and Sedat, who is in the room with you there, is also a member, is a group of scientists and plastics experts from around the world trying to support negotiators in creating an effective plastics treaty, a global treaty, which is currently under negotiation at the UN. But here, what we did was look at the different stages of the plastics life cycle and pollution. And we can see that already at a resource extraction, including both oil, but even bio-based products, we see release of oil and of chemicals, of pesticides and fertilizers that are coming out into the environment. The stage of polymer production, when the raw materials are made from the resources, we can have loss of pellets and spills. During manufacturing processes, paint and microplastics and other chemical additives can be released. There are problems during transportation and trade. There are problems in the commercial and industrial use of these products, also leading to chemical and micro and nanoplastic release, problems in the waste stage, and problems as we're facing the need to remediate environments that are currently polluted. These are two images from last year, one in the US and one in Turkey, both of them showing problems in the pre-plastic stage. So both of these were accidents where products and chemicals used to produce plastics were spilled into the environment. In the US, it was a train that crashed containing the precursors for PVC, a type of plastic that's commonly used in water piping and soft, flexible, like shower curtains and toys and things like this. And these precursors, these chemicals are toxic. And the second image was from a harbor in Turkey, and this picture I took off of Twitter, actually, but it was from a fire when there was an accident there after the earthquake, and chemicals were burning and releasing toxic gases into the environment. This is an image from Sweden, where we also have a plastics production plant showing plastic spills, both at the factory site and in the environment surrounding that. These are two images from spills that occurred during transportation. And Justine already mentioned the one in Spain. The other image is from Sri Lanka, where there was a shipwreck from the SS Pearl. And that ship was also contained not only plastic pellets, but also chemicals like BPA and others that were used in plastic products. There's been a number of studies done around that region and the impacts of those chemicals and plastics on the environment, and they're spread through the local environment. The spill in Spain was very recent, so there's a lot of scientists gathering around that issue right now to try to study impacts. But we know that those pellets contained quite high concentrations, probably, we haven't done the chemical analyses yet, of UV stabilizers that are hazardous. And according to the product description, it can be from 12 to 30% by weight of the plastic that is this chemical used to stabilize the molecules. Another image that is similar to what you've seen before, this is from a paper that I wrote with colleagues showing the increase in chemical and plastic production over the recent years. And I can also say that this is predicted to increase, and the industry is investing in increasing production of all of these chemicals and plastics products in the coming time. So this is something that we need to talk about as a global society. This is a scientific paper from 2020, where they calculated the total mass of animals on the planet and the total mass of plastics on the planet, and found that there were twice as many plastics as animals. And in the bottom part of the picture, you see trees and shrubs compared to buildings and infrastructure. And our buildings and our infrastructure are becoming increasingly plasticized as we use more plastics in infrastructure and building materials. And they're also having a shorter and shorter lifespan. So while buildings in the past lasted maybe for hundreds of years, now we're seeing a time when buildings, especially in the commercial sector, have a lifespan of 20 to 30 years before they're torn down and rebuilt. And even our interior design is being switched out more often, I think, than it has been previously calculated. But current estimates of the current amount of plastics on the planet are now at 11 gigatons, some more than that 8 that was in the study from 2020. So the amount of plastic that we're producing is rapidly increasing. I'm showing you the science behind a lot of what Justine said. So this is an image from another scientific publication showing us that even as we increase our ability to manage plastics in the waste sector, we will still lose plastics to the environment. This image shows 3 different scenarios. The yellow one is business as usual if we just continue as we are. The blue and green in the middle is using ambitious targets that are currently in place. And then the purple towards the bottom is where we should be aiming to be at a release of 8 million tons to the environment per year, which you could argue is still too high. And they've differentiated this into high income, upper middle income, lower middle income, and lower income countries, showing that the burden of release of plastics is different throughout the country. So it's not the same for different countries around the world. But even with the ambitious targets that we have in place now, we will still see an increase of release of plastics to the environment. And then if I remind you again of the novel entities framework, or the planetary boundaries framework, and how plastics are affecting that, we did an exercise where we put plastics in the middle, and we tried to understand how plastics are impacting other planetary functions and used scientific literature to understand that, and could find evidence of plastics impacting climate change. As you've already heard, plastics are made of oil, so there are direct connections to that. We also see changes in carbon sequestration in the oceans. We see changes in albedo, which is how much light is reflected from snow and ice caps, changing their ability to reflect light versus absorb heat. We see connections to greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at biodiversity, we also see evidence here of plastics impacting biodiversity through toxicity, also through transportation of invasive species. We see changes in microbial communities, so bacteria, fungus, that are important in antibiotic resistance, but also in nutrient cycling. And the sum of our research has shown this, that plastics are connected to every other aspect of planetary function and have the potential to destabilize the planet more than what we're already seeing. And just to give you some numbers here, more scientific papers showing us about the costs of plastics pollution, because the costs that are incurred are not absorbed by the companies making plastics. They're rather taking the economic winnings, putting in their pockets, and allowing the cost to be paid for elsewhere. There's a calculation that between $3,300 and $33,000 per ton per year are incurred in marine plastic pollution in the oceans in loss of ecosystem services. And this includes human well-being, the sense of well-being that we feel when we are in the environment, losses in tourism, impacts in fisheries, in marine food production, impacts in heritage areas. And these are extremely expensive, as you see. There was also a recent study that was just published 2 weeks ago on the human health costs of chemicals in plastics. And the classes of chemicals that were addressed there were BPA, BPDEs, PFAS, and phthalates. So these are plasticizers, softeners, and flame retardants. There are connections between exposure to these chemicals and cancer, hormone disorders, obesity, diabetes, infertility, preterm births, neurological impacts. And this study calculated that in the United States, the healthcare costs of exposure to these chemicals in plastics products is $249 billion per year, which is equal to 1.22% of the GDP. So these are absolutely astronomical numbers that are being paid for in medical costs, in human well-being, in human lives and bodies. And as you've heard, there are ongoing negotiations to create a resolution around plastics as is defined by a resolution that was voted on in 2022 to end plastic pollution towards an internationally legally binding instrument. And that's important, that this instrument should be legally binding. And the Scientist Coalition, which you've already heard about, was created to support this effort and to help ensure that the negotiations are based on evidence from the scientific community. This should be the best available science. There should be robust, independent science that is free from vested interests. So what we identify here as solutions, and I put the definition at the top, which is currently supported by, this exact wording is supported by 61% of member states. There are others that support other versions of this, but we see important solutions throughout the life cycle of plastic, starting with production reduction, one of the most important parts, establishing baseline and targets. We need better criteria to identify polymers and chemicals of concern and safety standards. We need to help shift our societies to reuse and refill systems. Some of this can be done through trade provisions. Improved waste management will most definitely be an issue, and we need better environmental remediation practices to deal with the plastics that's already out there. And I just want to stress that we see upstream measures as being absolutely vital, looking at production, banning chemicals of concern and polymers of concern, and this needs to be included throughout the life cycle of plastics and throughout the provisions in the future treaty. But I just wanted to take the last few minutes to talk about a problem that we've identified that we're working on in my lab on plastics at end of life. We've been working on recycling, and maybe you've seen numbers like this, and you heard also from Justine that only 9 or 10% of plastics have been recycled. I can say that sometimes incineration is counted as recycling. A lot of countries are landfilling plastics. There are countries that lack infrastructure for solid waste management at all, so there's a lot of mismanaged wastes in some parts of the world. And some of that is their own, but some of that is a problem through waste trade, which you've also heard about with countries generally from the global north exporting to countries generally from the global south. We're likely to see some more changes there. A few years ago, China was taking a large portion of this waste. They are no longer doing that. The European Union just recently decided to ban exports from Europe to non-OECD countries. Most of the data around this is around plastic packaging, though some of our work that I did together with Sedat and some others shows that these numbers might also be misleading because there are plastics and a lot of other kinds of materials that are traded that are not necessarily accounted for. This includes textiles, mixed paper bales, electronics wastes, and all of these also contain chemicals, of course. I'm sure you know this, but imports to Turkey have been increasing with the problems that are incurred with that, and managing the waste that is coming into the country. Plastics recycling is often touted as a solution to plastics pollution. Like, we can just recycle more, we have to increase recycling. There are legislation on the board requiring minimum amounts of recycled plastics in packaging materials and so on. But again, only 9% of plastics are currently recycled. There are some efforts to use chemical recycling, but as Justine also said, a lot of these technologies have not been scientifically proven, and when they are investigated, are shown to be neither economically nor environmentally viable solutions to dealing with plastics waste. And as I said, sometimes incineration is counted as a recycling. So some of the math and some of the data around these solutions and what they actually look like in reality are difficult to understand because different countries have different definitions, and sometimes just collecting the plastics is counted as recycling, and so on. So we don't know the exact numbers here, but we see that it's not working and plastics are not designed to be recycled. My group was working with recycled plastics from mostly global south countries, and you can see those countries on the map here, including one country in Eastern Europe. There's a photograph of what some of those pellets looked like, and we did chemical analyses on those. So the IPAN group did one of the initial analyses finding brominated flame retardants, UV stabilizers, and bisphenol A in a large number of those plastics. And these are all plastic additives. So it's not surprising to find that these would also be in recycled plastics. But what we did was look at the other chemicals that might be in there using different analytical techniques, and we were addressing also non-intentionally added substances. So not only plastic additives, but other chemicals that are contaminating the materials. And we found biocides, flame retardants, PAHs, pharmaceuticals, plant protection products, personal care products, all chemicals that should not be in the plastics that are likely coming into the plastics during the use phase. And a lot of these chemicals are toxic or have hazardous properties. This tells us that the way that we're recycling plastics right now mechanically is not safe. There are too many chemicals. There are too many mixed waste streams. There's too few controls on what is in the materials, what is going into recycling systems, and then ultimately where these plastics are ending up in their next iteration. What are these recycled plastics being used for? There's no transparency and reporting requirements around chemicals and plastics. There's no monitoring around chemicals and plastics. And this is a very big problem. If we're going to try to use these materials in a circular economy, this needs to be addressed. We did with a student, these are very preliminary data, not published yet. We put some of these plastics in water and we leached it for either 24 or 48 hours. So if you put these pellets in some water and just let them sit there, take the pellets out, and then we used that water to expose zebrafish embryos. So we collected eggs from zebrafish and put them into this water that had been in contact with the plastics. And then we followed their development for 120 hours. And this is some data. I don't expect you to look at all of this, but what I expect you to see here is that there's an increasing dose response over time. Each of the different colors is a different exposure scenario. So either 24 or 48 hours, and either a low dose or high dose of plastics that were in the water. And what we're showing here is data from gene expression. So we're looking at how many copies of different genes were found in the developing embryos, indicating that those genetic pathways are being affected by the chemicals in the plastics that leached into the water. And we see a lot of indications of obesogenes, meaning that these chemicals that are leaching out of the plastics into the water can affect fat metabolism and obesity in our fish. But this is also linking to some of the human health impacts that we see from plastics and plastic chemicals, effects on metabolism, diabetes, and obesity. So those chemicals are in these recycled plastics. So bringing us back to the plastics treaty and what we want to see there, we want to see that there are essential use criteria, moving away from this indiscriminate use of these materials to identifying essential use. Where do we need plastics? Where do we not need plastics? That we have to make sure that we're doing is safe and sustainable, using a very systematic understanding of plastics across its life cycle, across disciplines of knowledge, across the globe. We need increased transparency about what is happening and where, from production to chemicals, to products, to waste. We have to include human rights aspects, which Justine also talked about a little bit. And we need to make sure that the science we're using to understand these problems and to make decisions within the treaty are based on robust science. And this should be free from vested interests and conflicts of interest. I will stop there, and I guess I'll take some questions later if there are any.
Thank you very much, Bethanie. If it is appropriate for you, if you stay till the end of the panel, we will have Q&A later on so that you can answer. After listening, dear Justine and Bethanie, we understand the gravity of the situation, and plastics and recycling is not possible and viable. There is significant health problems, and seeing the examples, these exposures through water, how they are affecting the gene manifestations, that is a serious issue. And we will listen to the next speaker, one of the prominent figures about plastic studies, Sedat Bey. And we have listened to online speakers. Now we will listen to the physical speakers. Sedat Gündoğdu is next speaker. Since 2009, he has been lecturing in aqua products of marine biodiversity in Çukurova University about marine pollution. His studies focus on marine pollution, plastics and microplastics, introduction to marine environment and the impacts on the marine products and organisms. And currently, the sources of plastic waste and pollution and its distribution to different and the circulation of plastic waste across the countries and the studies on its impact on the planet. Plastics, is it a disaster or a new book published, strongly recommended to the participants by the next speaker? He is still studying in Çukurova University. The floor is to Sedat Bey.
Thanks for the introduction. When we say problem, we are referring to the common problem of plastics. Let me share my presentation with you. Yeah. Maybe there are people who already know this wave in the Japanese mythology. A visual artist used this wave to describe plastic pollution by way of designing this mythological wave. Actually, all of the oceans or aquatic environments of the world are encountering this problem of plastic pollution. Of course, I won't be talking about the global waters, but I will be talking more about Turkey. Now, most of us think that the issue of plastic pollution is a recent issue. But actually, the first one of the studies on plastic pollution was conducted in Turkey in 1987 about biodiversity in the Mediterranean coast. And while they were conducting this study, they reported there were lots of plastics, and they prepared a publication. And in our East Mediterranean coasts, this is our south coast, actually, the northeastern Mediterranean and our south coast. But there was also, this was a very important study because it talks about plastic pollution in Turkey. In Turkey, in the map, there are some parts that are darker in color and some are lighter. And these are marks that are describing the amount of plastics. And nowadays, even these amounts are more and more. Another study, if we go after like 15 years after this study, there was another study in the Aegean region. And the first evidences of the plastic pollution in Turkey can be seen there, and it was reported. And the results of that, well, this wasn't a very, well, as Bethanie just mentioned in her speech, the independization of the scientific research is a very important issue, and unfortunately, the sharing of academic information and the independent, to what extent it is independent or not, is something else to be discussed. In another study in 2007, 2008, in the Black Sea region, a very serious amount of plastic pollution was reported here. In the Marmara Sea region, also, there were similar studies. It was published. We remember the Marmara Sea with the issue of mucilage, as you know, and the relationship of science and policy is important to understand the issue of plastic crisis in Turkey, because although the provincial legislation was well entered into force in 83, after the 90s, we used to send these waste into the landfill areas, but when I say regular storage of waste, well, when I say regular storage, actually the same waste that used to be put together is
Adana'da, Ankara'da rastlamanız mümkün. Yani biz önümüzdeki gelecek nesillere aslında çöpü miras
actually just buried under the ground. So we're gonna be leaving this as a heritage to the future generations. And in the United States right now, there are some studies of excavation to understand the heritage from the past. And I think in the future, in anthropological studies, insight studies, there will be a new sector to excavate and rehabilitate the waste landfill areas, I believe, because burying and storing is not a way of managing waste. It is a way of making the waste invisible. And the dangerous way, well, because of the fact that Europe doesn't want to bury their own dangerous waste, this is being now used as a way of managing waste. For example, the zero waste regulation was published in 2019. Although it was published in 2019, we are still not encountering any example where these are actually being practiced. We can see some examples of this in Ankara province regarding the microplastic pollution. As of 2016, in Turkey, there were lots of studies published, one of them in Black Sea region in 2016, another one in 2017 for the Mediterranean region. And then hundreds of articles were established. And now in Turkey, we have a serious amount of data about plastic pollution for different parts of Turkey. When we found these plastics in Turkey, it had lots of repercussions, but no real consequences. And this is similar in Europe. Some products were banned in Europe, and our adventure in this sense is a little bit more tragic. There are lots of studies. I was involved in some of them on ground, in the rivers and lakes, and in the stomach and placenta of humans. I mean, we have no doubts that there are microplastics that are infused in lots of different environments, even in the organs of humans or other beings, or even in a natural area. It is not surprising anymore to encounter microplastics. These are known facts. What should be done from now on is to reduce the origin of this, basically, to eliminate the origin and the resources. And so we need solution proposals for restricting the production of plastics. The plastic waste trade, I mean, why it should be prevented. I mean, there are so many studies or research conducted about the plastic waste trade. But unfortunately, Turkey still continues to trade plastic waste, and they call it raw materials instead of waste. And we are able to collect only 10% of this. But what do we do with that? Well, info is missing about the management of plastic waste. This is from a website called Litterbase regarding plastic pollution in the coastal areas of Turkey, regarding the plastic pollutants. We are working in this region, so I mean, we regularly work on in this region. As you know, Istanbul is a metropolitan city, and there are lots of universities who examine this region. There are increasing researches about the plastic pollution. This is another study, as you can see here. Well, this is a study conducted by some Italian scientists about the plastic pollution in the Mediterranean coast, and as you see, Turkey has most of the pollution, which is red, and it's even purple. So the approximations are incredible, the predictions. And when this study was conducted, there were just a few studies to take as basis, and there are now more studies. And this one is about Turkey's inland waters. This is a systematic collection study in the lakes and rivers sediments. The existence of plastics is reported. Another study about the plastic pollution in the soil in Turkey. There are two studies, one of them was published, one of them not published yet, and it's about the use of the existence of plastics in the urban land. It is seen that there is a serious problem of microplastics and plastics. In the study that we conducted in Adana province, in the agricultural lands about micro irrigation, the drip irrigation. Well, in one area of soil, within a handful of area of soil, there was such a huge amount of microplastics, and we can say that the figures are incredibly high. There is an issue of stubble fire or bush fire in these areas. If you can remember, as you know, in Turkey we have lots of fires. Maybe the ones that are near Izmir province, or can remember that in Manisa there was another huge fire in Manisa province, in the Muradiye organized industrial district of Manisa. I don't remember the name of the facility, but there was a fire, and every month there are approximately 10 or 12 or 15 plastic recycling facilities that are put on fire. So the impact is way beyond what we can imagine. The fire in the harbor of Iskenderun was also huge, and there was such a chemical destruction, and the different agricultural hazardous substances were involved. And I had met a person who was in charge of evaluating something during that process, and he showed me, he told me that he wasn't even afraid of talking about the possible impact, the possible consequences, because there were so many new hazardous substances, but nobody was informed about the fact that they had to stay away from that area. I guess somebody's microphone was on. And this maybe there are some people who have leaked into our Zoom meeting. Some agents. It's okay. And this is about the plastic garbage, plastic waste import. Uh, this is some data from 2023, August 2023. Although it looks as if it has decreased, actually it has to do with the increase of the energy prices in Europe. So what can be the preventative measures in Turkey? There is only one preventative measure that can be taken into consideration. And that one is the practice of charging 25 cents fee for plastic bags. Before, you would laugh at this. Now you have maybe 25 cents in your pocket, and it's like, it's not an important amount to pay. And the fact that we are not able to uh, recycle the plastic in its origin, the fact that the garbage import continue, the waste import continues, the fact that the recycling facilities are put on fire. And regarding the Mediterranean coast, it's not only our own waste. We have the waste from Egypt, from Tunis. So there is a cumulative impact. In the plastic waste treaties, Turkey must have a pioneering role regarding the countries in the region, especially the East Mediterranean countries. Turkey should have a pioneering, a leading role, but the impression that we have is that we have been holding a very low profile, and the countries like China or Iran or Russia are doing their best so that there are no restrictions regarding the generation of plastics, the plastic production. there was a coalition, that kind of a coalition, and there were some countries that were like more in between. So in the end, Turkey actually should get involved in the group of those countries who are defending the limitation or the reduction of plastic pollution, because we are not exporting plastic. Thank you very much. Thanks to Dr. Sedat. Now, Deniz will be speaking. We still have lots of participants in Zoom and in our hall. I will give the floor to Deniz. Deniz Bayram is a lawyer, registered at Istanbul Bar Association since 2010. She has worked in various civil society organizations on gender, environment, and climate issues. And among those organizations that she has worked and consulted with are More Chatham Women's Shelter Foundation, Greenpeace, Mediterranean, Medicine Sans the Doctors Without Borders, Change.org Climate Program, among others. She prepared a master's thesis on environmental crimes in light of the international developments at Galatasaray University, Department of Public Law, and she is a research assistant at the international human rights organization, Human Rights Watch. Dear Denise, the floor is yours.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much. So
Being the
now,
last speaker of the session, I will have this advantage, but the presentation so far, many of the things mentioned, the impacts or negative impacts, and social and daily life, how they are affecting. More human rights violation dimensions I will talk about, and I will try to use it as an advantage. Thank you very much for inviting me as speaker to this session today. I'm more than happy. And also, in year 2022, we have published plastic recycling, human violations in plastic recycling sector. The outcomes of the report will also be presented in this presentation. I will be repeating many of the things, the impacts of plastic on human health and human welfare, the studies. There are few studies, and there are more dramatic impacts than known or thought. And in addition, how plastic was introduced to Turkey and how is the situation in Turkey. Few information on the current situation in Turkey. The most important aspect is throughout the years, from 2008 to 2020, it was very critical period for Turkey because plastic waste imports significantly and dramatically increased from 2008 to 2020. China banning the import of plastic. Turkey became one of the major destinations for plastic wastes. And if we put it into figures, the plastic import increased from 4,000 tons to 33,000 tons per year. And starting from 2018, periodically there were fluctuations and increases, but overall speaking, it was 33,000 tons per year import of plastic since 2018. With this dramatic increase, how was Turkey caught up in this increase? Significant infrastructure, lack of infrastructure, and lack of legal legislation. Just consider at your borders, there is 4 or 5 times more plastic waste coming to your borders, and within your country's borders, the production and manufacturing of the plastic waste in your borders, and 5 times more plastic waste coming to your country, and some of them are recyclable, and significant amount are not recyclable. That is complete waste that cannot be recycled. And as Dr. Sedat also mentioned in his presentation, referring to many of the studies shows that they have significant impact on social and human welfare. And significant incidents that could cause environmental crisis. I will be referring to those incidents. In many parts of Turkey, but especially in port cities like Izmir, Smyrna, Adana, Mersin, the cities that are neighboring to ports and harbors, the imported waste that is dumped into the nature, environmental pollution was caused by these imported wastes. This environmental pollution that I am mentioning here is not a small scale plastics that you come across on the bay or on the shores or in urban area, not plastic waste. This is tens of tons of waste dumped into nature and somehow mixing into the nature and mixing to the agricultural lands. These are major plastic wastes. And lack of legal legislation, infrastructure, and practical deficiencies. What do we mean? For instance, in customs authorities, this imported waste, the control and audit and inspection, are they coming here for recycling? Are they recyclable waste, or where are they heading to? Where are they coming from? The qualified staff to carry out the inspection of the waste is limited at the borders authorities, customs authorities. But during that time period, there were none experts at the customs for inspecting these imported waste. And also there were some unregulated imports. Many of the recycling, so-called recycling companies imported waste from unknown origins, and they were importing these wastes from different countries and from different exporters. And many of these products were plastics, and many incidents happened as a result. Ministry of Industry and Trade during this time period, there was an application on behalf of the environmental NGOs and stakeholders, these insufficiencies, and dramatically Turkey importing multiplied times of wastes because of infrastructure and implementation mechanisms and legal legislation regulation deficiencies. This dramatic increase in the somehow trying to which measures are taken to accommodate this increased import of waste. When we ask to the ministry, these plastic waste coming to our country are of high economic value and they are imported for recycling purposes. They cannot be qualified as waste. This was the answer of the ministry. And in the same day, in Izmir Kemal Pasha, maybe some may recall, an environmental institution organization had a reporting, received a report. People were leaving. It was a residential area. This was a residential area, and a family in the backyard of a house. Tons of coming from country of origin is Italy. Plastic waste from the country of origin is Italy. They were dumped into this backyard, and immediately next to this there was large agricultural lands, and considering the environmental conditions, these plastic waste were starting to scatter and expand to these agricultural lands. We are calling it plastic waste, but they are also pharmaceutical and medical waste were also there. And indeed, later on, when we have carried out studies on this area, these wastes, these letters, the person bringing them to here, when they received this, they thought that this was recyclable waste, because that period can be described as all of a sudden the recycling sector, there was significant economic opportunities, and they were just purchasing and not making it a part of the recycling process. They will purchase and they will sell it to others, and non-expert persons who have no knowledge or experience about recycling of the materials, who cannot even tell what is recyclable and what cannot be recyclable, somehow they were importing and bringing the waste into Turkey. Later on, this person in their own warehouse, there is a fire breakout and they don't know what to do, because tons of waste with medical waste, house waste, domestic waste, and hazardous waste, even containing hazardous waste and medical waste. We have personally investigated and inspected this. They could not cope with this problem, and they dumped this waste into the backyard of a family by paying certain amount of money to the family. This was piles of waste, and we have made an reporting to the prosecutor's office, and we made a renunciation, and this was broadly covered in the media. And in this time period, Ministry of Environment called the person, that perpetrator, and get rid of these waste and do whatever you do, but you need to get rid of them. This person was instructed to get rid of. Ministry of Environment was very sensitive, and they were demanded to dispose these waste. This tons of waste, this huge pile of waste, was taken to incineration facility in Manisa, and later on it was incinerated. I will tell about the legal processes and procedures. Somehow there is public pressure emerging on this topic. This legal process went very seriously. This person's company was imposed a monetary fine, significant amount of monetary fine, and I will talk about it. And also Kemal Pacha Court of Crime, Criminal Court, started public proceedings, and a very significant process, and it is still in Court of Appeal process. This criminal case is still pending and ongoing at Court of Appeal. Ministry of Environment and Climate Change became a party to this court case, and they have been on the. It was quite interesting because they had to be controlled and regulated for bringing this authority is a party to the court case as the harmed party. These harbor and port cities have significant waste problems. It's more visible in the cities that has ports and harbors. Adana is a known example. The visuals here shows throughout these years uncontrolled disposal of the waste during a period of unregulated legislation. This internationally imported and how they are incinerated. In year 2020 and 2022, we have visited Adana frequently, and there is these waste dumped into nature and into canals, and still they are still there in nature. It is a normalization, normalizing and rationalizing the presence and of these wastes there. These wastes are still there. I don't know the current situation, but that scandalous incidents covered in international media, still these wastes were there and it was waste was still there. Most of my presentation will tell about Human Rights Watch report published in 2020 on the import of plastic waste from the perspective of human rights and the impacts of plastic recycling in Turkey on human health. They are poisoning us, the titled report. This report was published by Human Rights Watch, and there is a significant research team behind this report. The drafters of the report, I would like to name. Sorry, the voice quality is too bad and we can barely hear. We will do our best to provide interpretation about it. And this report and what we have done and which studies were conducted, what were the observations and interviews for this report, I will briefly tell about. They are poisoning us, plastic recycling, and they are telling us and sometimes such fumes, such cases, fumes coming from the facilities as if they are poisoning us. This was a statement by one of the respondents to an interview, a survey, as if they are poisoning us. They would, and SDGs, these workers working in the recycling facility and people residing very close to these facilities, it poses a significant threat to them. Within the scope of this study, around 30 persons were interviewed, and many of them were workers in these recycling facilities. Our study was focusing on Adana and Elbistan regions. There is a video, but I can show it later because there is a voice-related problem. You can share it. You need to share it with the voice. If you make the proper selection, I will share it later. I will show it later. Okay. The speaker says that I will show it later. Here, within the scope of this study, we have visited many provinces, and plastic recycling center is heavily concentrated in these regions. The focus is Adana and Istanbul because we had significantly meaningful data in Adana, specifically Onur, Ova, Shakir Pasha, Uchak districts. They had more, the recycling facilities were concentrated here. It's like an industrial zone that you go to here. And this region, we have also questioned, it's like an industrial zone, but people are living, it's an urban area, it's a residential area, and these recycling facilities are very close to residential areas and people's houses and their residential areas. For instance, there was school in that neighborhood and hospitals and social facilities were there. Here, plastic recycling facilities in red and school that you see, and the neighborhoods, plastic recycling facilities positioned as per the public facilities. This yellow marked one as a schools regions. There are schools in that region from primary school to high school, age grade. There is different levels of schools in this region. Is 250 meters to plastic recycling facilities. And we have been to one of the schools with our researchers, and we have interviewed with the school headmasters and with the students also. A school day, we have observed the day of the students at the school, and in the room of the school headmaster, this plastic, you could have the sounds and the smells of, and when the students were continuing their education life and they were continuously exposed because plastic recycling facilities works around the clock and they are exposed to this noise all the time. And it's disturbing, and when you are exposed systematically, more different impacts on the schools and their learning achievement, smell, and also the odor, and also people living in that vicinity, in their neighborhood, there was park facilities, health facilities also, and it was very close to residential areas. And also in Istanbul, these facilities were concentrated Sultan Gazi and Bayrampaşa, Başakşehir, and compared to Adana, they were not that close to residential areas, but still they were in the vicinity of public facilities such as hospitals. The stages of recycling facilities, we have visited them, and this recycling activity, if we look at them, this was mentioned briefly by some of the previous speakers, the stages of recycling. In the recycling facility, this recycling process have some stages, and each stage, not all facilities carry out all these processes. There is differentiation, and some facilities carry out the complete loop of recycling. Some carries out first the classification of plastic waste, because plastics are of different characteristics and specifications, and this classification is critical for recycling. And in Turkey, this classification or separation, and people working in the as they are not separated at source, this separation is a separate activity, and there is high cost of separation of waste for recycling sector. In Europe, mostly the separation and classification is done more carefully and duly. And classified plastic waste important from Turkey, it's less cost, it's cost effective. The classified or the separated wastes are more has higher profit margin, and there is plastic conveyor belt, and they are crushed into small pieces according to certain codes and sizes. They are separated and they are smashed into small pieces, and there is washing processes and drying processes. And during this washing, these plastics are washed, and we have seen there is a wastewater created during this washing activity, significant amount of water used for washing the waste. And we have observed that the details of this, that is also the research findings on these impacts. And I would like to state here the facilities we have visited in Adana. There was no water treatment facility, and this wastewater after the washing of the plastics, they were dumped into the rivers or the canals without treatment. And it's a question mark where they are going to. And similarly, and many of they were using the illegal electricity in many of these facilities. Plastic waste recycling, another stage of plastic recycling is melting or mushing, heating the plastics and reshaping the plastics after melting. And as we have previously saw, those pellets, to create them, they are going through a melting process, and later on they are reshaped. For instance, in we can say according to this melting process melting machine, those particle substances, it is really difficult because not particles, because they were visible, and significantly exposure to toxins, you could feel it, and even personally you could have that sensations, those feelings. The findings of this research, if we go with the findings of the research, persons working in the recycling facilities, who they are and who the demographics of these people, when people residing here, mostly they were child workers, refugees, and undocumented migrants. Therefore, this sector is also causing the violation of human rights, mostly the already discriminated persons and disadvantaged persons and vulnerable persons are. And in this region that we worked in Adana, if the 1990s, Turkish armed forces carried out operations in eastern and southeastern parts of Turkey, terrorist operations, anti-terror operations, and there was internal migration, and many of the persons residing in that region were those that migrated from southern and southeastern part of Turkey, and there was social transformation in that region. And at the beginning, with the migration from Syria, now this region, there is a hierarchy of migrants in this for the workforce of this recycling facilities. Previously, they were carrying out the collection of the waste, and now they have been more disadvantaged groups, vulnerable groups that came there from Syria are now working in the lower jobs, and there is hierarchy of these demographic groups in this sector also. And the refugees and irregular migrants are working in the lowest jobs in that sector, and this makes them even further disadvantaged because there is an exploit of labor force, and it's a illegal employment. And one of the critical findings is that child labor, significant amount of child labor and child workers in the sector, even going down to 9 years old children. And in some of these facilities, they told us, some of the workers told us they started to work in this sector when they were child. There were still child and refugee children. And those respondents that we carried out interviewed with 5 of them, we could tell that they were minors. And those working in the plastic recycling sector, the fees and the wage and salaries are well beyond the minimum wage, and there is an exploit of labor force, and these people are unpaid. They don't pay tax, and they are vulnerable without social insurances. They are children. It's according to Turkish legislation, it is prohibited to employ these children. Only children or minors from 16 to 18 years old can be employed on some certain sectors and jobs. But this was plastic recycling sector, plant textile manufacturing. These are hazardous sector that requires chemical procedures, and it is prohibited. There is ban on child employment, minor employment in these sectors. And children were working in this sector, are employed in this sector informally and illegally, and it was informal economy, and the salaries and wages were quite low, and they were working 12 hours per day at average. They stated to be working 12 hours a day, and they were working till late midnight shifts, and younger women working, they were not given any leaves or any, there was no holiday time or leaves for them, and they were afraid to lose their jobs. For instance, younger women working in textile and male, there was also salary and wage differences, and the working hours and the type of works that they do. There was differentiation between this demographic of workers. Another important issue about these workers in recycling sector, protective equipments, personal protective equipments were not provided to the workers. And in some of the recycling facilities that we had visited, the workers were not wearing masks or gloves or protective measures, and they were directly touching to the plastics and with their bare skin, and they were continuously exposed to these plastic waste, and protective equipments were not provided and used by the workers. Of course, this is an informal sector, and as it became an informal sector, it's not about the salaries and the wages, and their right to access to health services was also violated because there was no insurance for them, and they did not have a right to access to health services. And I would like to specifically state that textile in Istanbul and Adana that we had visited in Istanbul and Adana, and there were licensing requirements by the Ministry of Health, and they were not observed. Not due authorization and licensing was provided to these facilities, and the municipality, local government licenses and authorizations were not there. And we have carried out interviews, and financially, sorry, the voice quality is decreasing with the very low voice that we have, and we cannot hear. and there was unregistered and unauthorized, uncertified facilities without authorization and necessary permits. We have identified that these facilities and the people that we have carried out interviews, they were working minors, child laborers, and illegal or irregular migrants and informal workers were employed in these unregistered facilities, unauthorized facilities, and no audits and inspections were carried out in these facilities. We have learned from the interviews that we have carried out, indeed, and there were also, we would like to emphasize that Ministry of Health or public authorities carries out inspections and audits in registered facilities. If it is an unregistered facility, they are not subject to the provisions and they do illegal activities and they continue their activities and for the registered facilities, from the child workers and from other workers and employees, we have heard that the audits and inspections were previously informed, and before the child workers were sent to their home at the previously reported or notified pre-notified audits and inspections, child workers were sent to their homes and protective equipments were not provided to them. And during our interviews with the workers from 15 to 20 years old who came from Syria to Adana, these refugees, these young girls that we have interviewed who are working at the recycling facility, employers were forcing them to work long hours of work and they were not provided with protective equipment. And these people that we had interviews, in their bodies, on their skins, there were allergic reactions and symptoms of exposure, on their hands especially because of continuous exposure to, there were burns and lesions or some harms and damages. And they were not provided with protective equipment. And when we asked them, they have shown us these gloves, and only these gloves they were given. And they were given one time when they first start working, and they were not renewed, and they were not provided. They were continuously using these gloves. They have to be renewed continuously, but they were given one time these gloves, and they were never given a new glove. And then they were no longer protective when they are continuously used. And when we have deepened our studies to the people sitting in the neighborhood, and during the interviews, the people that we have interviewed, they were very close to the facilities, recycling facilities, and those people were, and these recycling facilities, they were exposed to the severe pollution of odor. And when children go through this neighborhood, children were walking through this polluted environment to their schools. And these facilities were appearing, their numbers were increasing. They were just popping up like the mushrooms in the front parts. The number of facilities increased, and this pollution also became more and more significant. And in the facilities that we have visited, there was no weather quality measurement device or any measurement as to the air quality in those facilities.
So I believe we will also continue the discussion in the Q&A session. So I want to mention the replies of the public institutions. One of the most surprising outputs for me was that especially in Istanbul and Adana, but especially in Adana, the municipalities, the metropolitan municipalities, I mean, within the applications that we made to these municipalities, we realized that the local administration, the local authorities had no idea about the issues regarding the damage actually, according to the documents that we had obtained by way of the relevant people that we had interviewed, there were lots of claims and grievances, but these weren't communicated to the relevant people, the complaints and grievances. And they told us that there were the employers were fined with very high amounts of penalties, financial administrative penalties, but also in some cases we know that these fines, the administrative fines, weren't paid, like in the example of Kemal Pasha. For example, the administrative fine wasn't paid duly and the case still continues. Also, regarding the controls with respect to the presence of the measurement equipments, about the air pollution, etc., we know that since the beginnings of 2010, there were inspections, but especially in the recent years, from 2020 on, since 2020, they just encountered 9 cases where well, actually, we had seen 5 children in Adana, but we know that the number should be higher. The outputs of our report made us possible to create some proposals, and they are very detailed proposals, but I won't enter into detail because I have limited time. But the first one has to do with the human rights violations aspect of the waste trade within the context of Turkey, and that there should be a ban again, and the waste that is generated within the limits of European Union should be managed within the limits of European Union, should be managed and eliminated. This is also one proposal. The Ministry of Environment, Trade and Health, and Ministry of National Education, and also Ministry of Labor and Social Security our proposals were also communicated to these ministries and the municipalities. Unfortunately, well, I also want to mention very briefly that after we published our study, we had a meeting with the Ministry of Environment, and during this meeting, we were told that the plastic waste will be reduced every year gradually. We were told that there is such a policy, and that beginning with, as of 2022, the amount of waste that is traded from abroad would be reduced gradually with a certain percentage. Well, as you know, Turkey was involved within the plans of plastic trade in the beginning, and then it was changed in the European Commission. And right now, the trade of waste exportation to Turkey depends on certain inspections, and there will be an internal control of this process, and we are following up with that process. Thank you very much. Deniz, thank you so much for your presentation. Dear colleagues, we have listened to our speakers, and we understood that the issue of plastic is actually an issue. It's a problem, a systematic issue, a systematic problem, and that recycling actually is a story. And now, let's continue with questions. Justine just told us that she has only half an hour, and if there are any questions that you want her to address, we can first receive those questions for Justine. We can have one question from the hall and an online question, and a question from our online participants. Let's first give priority to female participants. Anybody who has questions from the hall to begin with? Are you looking as if you have a question? If you want, you can come here so that everybody can hear you better. Those who are asking the questions, can you introduce yourselves? Thank you very much. My name is Mehmet. I am from the CASDO Association for the Preservation of Natural and Cultural Resources. I have a question for Justine. For the plastics, she said that it's a dangerous issue. The what is the form? What is the criteria for the form and the measurement of this danger in terms of the nature, in terms of the human beings, in terms of the other beings, like other than human beings? What is that dangerous limit, or what is the limits of that danger? Could she talk a little bit about that? Is there also any question from the online participants? No online questions. Any other question from the hall? I have a question. I can ask in English. You can ask in Turkish. I want to ask in English. Zeynep, you can write your question in the chat section because we couldn't hear you well. Mr. Özer seems to have a question. Yes. Hello, my name is Özer Erke. Sorry, I will turn my camera on. Hello, thank you very much for all of the presentations. My question is to everyone. Will these presentations, after these presentations, I'm wondering whether there is any hope, because we are within a limited context in terms of the things that we can change, because we are not able to have a very big influence in terms of the policies. We were hoping to, you know, bring more awareness to people, but I am not very optimistic either. Thank you in advance. So any other questions from the hall? After all of these pessimistic information, well, I don't know what to say. I am Kubilay. My name is Kubilay, and each time I hear or I read something about these issues, I'm a little bit more discouraged or heartbroken. As you know, there is an island called Borneo, and there is a plant called bamboo. Once upon a time, it was produced only in the island of Borneo, and for example, uh, a script that is produced in Germany should be sent to Borneo, or a car produced in Germany should be sold to Borneo. And there are like hundreds of kilos of plastic materials, substances. I'm having a look at this room. Well, my colleagues from the association painted the some of the covers by hand. I know that. But apart from that, I mean, everything is being traded to some other region, similar to the issue with plastics. The big factories said that the 21st century it will be the century of aluminium. Within the European Union, there are crises, and the population of the world is now growing to 8 billion, and I am wondering whether we can be hopeful still. Thank you very much, Kubilay. We have an online participant, Zeynep. We are listening to you. Zeynep İlhan, can you hear us? Hello, yes, I can. Can you hear me too? Yes, we can. We have two participants that are named Zeynep. Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for your presentations. My question, well, in the previous question, there was the issue of hope and whether we're losing hope, and I want to address that. We have hope all the time. And secondly, I have a question for our four speakers. You are within these issues, both in terms of, both from an academic or social um, perspective, and it's a personal question for you. There is a saying in Turkish uh, which says that the shoemaker's son always goes barefoot, or the cobbler's children have no shoes. So I'm wondering whether you personally are, I mean, how you personally are dealing with the issue of plastics. And I have another question. Not the recycling of plastics, but in order to decrease the toxicity of plastics, I know that there are some scientific studies that are conducted in order to reduce the toxicity of plastics by way of mushrooms. So, how effective do you think those can be? Thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak. So uh, go. Let's give the floor to Justin first. Let's go with the same chronological order of the speakers. If there's anything that you would like to add, Justin, apart from the questions, or also you can do that.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone, for the questions. Maybe on the first one on the dangers, I may actually also let Bethanie and Sedat add more on that because they are the scientists. But I think what I was basically wanting to show is that indeed, like plastic has an impact on quite a lot of ecosystems and health, like really looking at a perspective of things. And then the reality is there's still also a lot we don't know about the impacts of plastic, about the impacts of chemicals. In plastic, as we explained, there's a lot of chemicals in there for which we don't really know whether they are safe or not, because they haven't been tested. And then when it comes to microplastic and nanoplastic, because they're so small, there's also really lots of concern of whether they could like pass some of the barriers in our bodies, etc. But the research is super new, so we may need more time to understand it better. But yeah, maybe Bethanie and Sedat want to add on that. On the hope and what we can do, I think indeed, I mean, the picture is not looking really good. And at the same time, there's also been massive mobilization in the last few years, I would say, in a decade. And that has played a big role as well. And we've seen like progress. So it is slow, but there's lots of local initiatives that are really bringing change. So we see lots of local policies or local initiatives to support like zero waste initiatives, for example, and it's growing and offering a bit more of a choice to the consumers. And then at the policy level, it's been extremely slow, but we've also seen some changes. Bethanie and others mentioned obviously we all mentioned the big issue with waste trade and the fact that the EU decided a few weeks ago that they will stop trading, like exporting plastic waste to non-OECD countries, and also regulating better the trade to other countries. This is a positive sign, and I think to be honest, maybe 5 years ago when the movement started to really work on this topic, we were not that helpful, and yet things moved quite a lot. Like there was a lot of working all together, showing the impact from the recipient countries and bringing the voices from the impacted communities to the exporter countries really played a big role. So I do feel like there's like this community really gives me hope, the fact that we can bring voices and images and showing what really is happening all across the world, and bringing it to the decision makers and putting them in front of their responsibilities, as well as bringing them to the big companies producing plastic and its feedstock. I think that's what gives me hope. So I think there's still there's a lot, and at least it's a topic that is quite on the public agenda, I would say. Of course, not always, but I do feel like there's still quite a bit of attention. There's people mobilizing all across, and I do think that the plastics treaty that Bethanie talked quite a bit about is really a strong opportunity, and all the governments in the world are negotiating this. And therefore, there's really an opportunity there to just push our governments to be more ambitious on that, to be more ambitious on this. So that's a few things on the mushroom. I have no clue, so I may also let the scientists answer if they know a bit more about this. But yeah, I want to thank you all, and happy to continue the conversation. And yeah, indeed, I think like even just the presentations from today, I think they show like the importance of having people from across sectors coming, and scientists and people doing more like policy, and then also people working like with workers and legal cases. There's putting all those kind of strategies and elements all together. I trust we can make a difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justine. Now the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm jumping in. And I'm going to try to take the questions in order as well regarding human health and the hazards there first. Obviously, I presented data around chemicals, and we do know a bit more there, even though we also lack data on thousands of the chemicals used in plastics. When it comes to microplastics and nanoplastics, we're just beginning to understand what the kinds of impacts might be in humans, even if we do have more data from testing in marine organisms and aquatic organisms. And now we're starting to get data from from organisms living in terrestrial environments as well. We're also developing better technologies so that we can detect plastic particles in different kinds of samples, including in human tissues. So there is accumulating evidence of micro nanoplastics in humans in different organs. It's been documented in placenta, in lungs, even in brain. So we know that we are being exposed. There's some early evidence showing that there might be impacts from the particles themselves in gut health, so in irritable bowel syndrome and things like this. Evidence from animal studies show us that microplastics can impact the microbiome, so the kinds of microbes that are living in the guts of animals, which can in turn impact health. But again, it's early days and we don't have a good understanding of the health impacts in humans yet. So we'll have to wait a few years before we get there. When it comes to the toxicity side of things, there are so many chemicals that are used in plastics that are used in our societies, and that is problematic. Which is one of the reasons why I'm arguing for a need to simplify that market, that we should be using fewer chemicals with better data. We should have better requirements on transparency, that companies need to tell us what's in their products and how much of it, and what those molecules look like, so we can understand harm and potentially mitigate that. And then that this should be followed through the lifespan of plastics, where we do have all these different actors. And tying into a bit what some of the others have said, there are people exposed throughout the lifespan of plastics, starting at the very beginning with extraction and production, where fence line communities are exposed through air and through water and through the food chain, all the way through to use, where we're exposed through all the materials we have around us. Our food packaging is an important source, to waste pickers and people working in the informal waste sector that are also exposed. So there are a lot of exposure routes that we're also starting to understand. And on top of that, I can tie in with the mushrooms. There are a number of examples of potential bio-based sources of plastics. And this here, the language gets a bit difficult, because sometimes bioplastics are actually natural materials like starches or natural polymers. Sometimes bio-based materials are used to make traditional plastics like polyethylene and polypropylene. So we need some clarification around that language. And I would like to see that put into legal text so that we're very clear on what we're talking about. But when it comes to bio-based plastics, we know that they also contain chemicals. So they are not inherently less toxic because they're bio-sourced. What we can say about them is that they take us one step away from fossil fuels, which can most definitely be a good thing. But we also need to be mindful of other problems that might be caused there. I think it was Justine that mentioned earlier about switching to paper, and paper also contains chemicals. Paper products can be coated with chemicals or lined with plastics even. So we have to have a large scale understanding of what we're talking about. But studies on bio-based plastics do show that they can be as toxic or more toxic than traditional plastics, because the molecules are inherently less stable. So just a word of warning, just because it's like quote unquote natural doesn't mean that it's actually natural or safer. That brings us back to the requirements for safety and sustainability by design. We have to make sure that the things we're putting on the market are safe and they are sustainable. Question about whether or not I have hope. Yes. As you can see, there are a lot of people working on this question around the world. There's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of energy behind it. And yeah, there are bad actors that are trying to stop this momentum and have been doing so for decades. But as we increase awareness and as we increase people's understanding of the problems and the need for change, I think we will be able to start driving change. And a lot of that will have to be top down. So politicians are going to have to make decisions to control the market and can control the products and the way that we're using these materials globally. But they will need support from citizens and from people that will support those decisions, and that will also be willing to make behavioral changes that will need to come, because we're going to need to change the way we do things in our societies. So information is important, and behavioral change is important. Attitudes are important. Top down and bottom up change is coming. I think it's coming. I think it has to come. So I do have hope, even if I know that what we have before us is a very difficult battle. None of this is easy. It's very complicated and it will be difficult. But I have to have hope. In my own personal life, I try to avoid plastics where I can, but it's impossible. We will always come into contact with plastics. I mean, this shirt is a polyester blend, and our food comes in plastics, and our houses are filled with wiring, and like my computer is filled with plastics. We have it all around us. It's unavoidable. But we can hopefully build better societies that have safer plastics and less plastics. So this is what I'm looking for. What? I don't know. I think I hit all the questions. I'll mute myself if there's no more and pass on to Sedat. Oh, fungi breaking down. Okay. I just saw a question pop into the chat. There are a number of technologies that have been put forth as solutions to plastic pollution, and it's been things like fungi or larvae or bacteria. And I don't see those as a long-term, large-scale solution. I think maybe in some cases they might help if we have biodegradable plastics that are used in specific sectors in closed loop areas. They might be able to help us, but for the large scale, absolutely not. We can't have microbes breaking down plastics everywhere on the planet, because that would make our lives on the planet impossible. And life on the planet will continue whether we're here or not. But I've also heard suggestions. There have been microbes found in the deep ocean that can degrade plastics. But if we start producing these microbes and they are in the environment, then they'll start breaking down plastics. And then who wants to fly in an airplane that has microbes chewing on it, or sail in a boat across the ocean that's degraded as we're sailing? So we do need plastics, and they have to be stable where we need them to be stable, and they have to be degraded where we need them to be degraded. And we have to find systems that can separate those two things and contain them in the right place, in the right way. And microbes are difficult to control. So again, in very closed loops and very specific applications, it might be something that is useful, but not on a large scale. Okay, now I'm muting.
Thank you very much, dear Bethany. Before we continue with Professor Sedat, let's take a family photo. If everybody is ready, can everybody turn on their cameras so that Özlem can take a family photo to have a memory of this coming together? Thank you very much, everyone. It's done. Thank you, Özlem. So, dear Sedat, the floor is yours, and there are lots of questions. There is no direct question to me, I guess, but I guess there is no question that is directed to me personally, but in general, Max Liboilo has a definition that I would like to use to answer. He has a book called Pollution is Colonialism. And the book says that trying to define a limit value to prove that something is dangerous actually means that we are using something as a material. So if you want to define a pollution threshold for the soil, that will turn the soil into a meta. So it will turn it into a commodity, let's say. And on the other hand, after all of these evidences that are mentioned, how can we continue growing hope? I think it will be almost 10 years that I have been working on this issue. But we still have hope. I mean, the more that you learn, the more ambitious you become to continue to struggle. And there is something called climate anxiety. There is something like an anxiety, a disorder, as much as you learn about the climate crisis that can develop. But if we won't continue struggling, then there is no sense in working on all of these. Once upon a time, a climate activist child said something about this issue. This child said, I'm not interested in using um, um, using a pipette or not. I am interested in whether the use of plastics is banned or not. I guess there is another question. So the question for me is whether the recycling facilities for the domestic waste, whether they should be recycling facilities or not. So, as Bethany mentioned, there are thousands of chemicals that are added into the processes, and while talking about the impact of these plastic substances, what should happen is that not so many different chemicals should be used. There we have a researcher friend called Martin Wagner, and once he said that I wish that the plastic producers didn't use so many chemicals so that we wouldn't need to work on the uh, toxicology aspect. So eliminating chemicals from the plastics could solve an aspect, a part of the problem. Thank you. Thank you.